Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews, episode number 4.
Yeah.
So, I just finished processing the work we did with Michael Parenti's book, Inventing Reality. It was really, it's a really good review. I think people should watch it. Obviously. So, I'm looking forward to this week's. I think we're going to talk about something that's relevant to current events.
Yes. So, as I think many of your listeners probably know, over the last few weeks, we have seen the continued bombardments against the Palestinian people by the State of Israel. And recently, as I think even today, President Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, met with President Benjamin Netanyahu about policies going forward and so on and so forth. And so I thought, because this is so fresh on people's minds, the sort of the movement for Palestine and the sort of egregious crimes of Israel over the last, few weeks, to sort of read a book that would be relevant to the discussion that provides, I think, much needed, not only historical context, but also, I think, some theoretical understanding as well. And with that in mind, we're going to be talking tonight about Edward Said's The Question of Palestine, which is a classic work. This was published, I think, in the late 1970s, 1979. This edition was published in 1992 with a couple extra selections of writing where he kind of updates and talks about, sort of the developments post 1979. So while the book is slightly dated, there's actually quite a bit in it that reads like you could have ripped it out of the pages of the book, put it into the context of what we're talking about today, and it would fit. Okay. Largely because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as the media often likes to talk about it, when in reality what it is it's a conflict in and of itself, only in as much as the media wants to paint it as one, because it isn't really so much a conflict so much as it is a settler colonialism issue, which we'll get into. But to give you some background, so Edward Said was the professor of comparative literature at Columbia, and he also taught at Harvard, Johns Hopkins. He is best known probably for his incredibly path-breaking work, Orientalism, which came out a few years after this book. I recently listened to an interview of his where he talked about how this book, the question of Palestine, is sort of a part of an informal trilogy of books that he wrote on these questions: Orientalism, The Question of Palestine, and a book he wrote called Covering Islam, which is interesting because that book is very much kind of like the last book we talked about, where it's a critique of the media in relationship to covering Islam and particularly covering the Muslim world, which in and of itself is sort of a broad generalization. So Said was born in Palestine in the 1930s, and he died in 2003 after a long bout with cancer. Those of you who've probably heard his name, who are maybe in the atheist humanist circles, probably know about the very public break that the late author Christopher Hitchens had with Edward Said over the question of Islamism or Islamofascism, as Hitchens called it. Hitchens was an early sort of celebrator of Said's work, and then post 9/11 they have this very public break, which goes in line with a lot of what happens with Hitchens.
Yeah, that's right.
As his political shift, right? So what he does in this book is he does a couple of things. One of them is that he provides historical context for understanding where the Israeli-Palestinian conflict comes from, and ultimately what it has meant for Palestinians. So he talks about how there have been numerous books about Israel from the Israeli perspective, keeping their concerns in mind. But at the time, there weren't as many books written in the English language that explicitly dealt with the issue of Palestine and from the standpoint of Palestinians. Okay. So I think this is an incredibly brilliant work. It's the first book of his I'd ever read. He has a long list of books that are incredibly influential in the field of post-colonial studies. Obviously, I mentioned Orientalism. The other book that's really important is a book called Culture and Imperialism. And he's done public lectures and stuff you can probably watch on YouTube.
Definitely have to check some of those out.
Yeah, for sure. And so being born in Palestine, he came to the United States as one of many people who became a part of the sort of Palestinian diaspora, which at the publishing of this book was around 4 million people. Today, it's actually closer to around 6 million people.
Okay.
And he talks about how Palestinians around the world are sort of divided into different groups. So you have those who always lived within Israel proper. Then there were those who lived in the sort of Palestinian territories. Okay. And then there were those who left. Some by choice, mostly not by choice. And those people ended up going into countries like Jordan, Syria, the United States, the UK, other parts of Europe. And so, interestingly enough, much like the Jewish diaspora, which still exists to this day, I think the global population of Jewish people is like 20 million or something like that. And again, they're scattered all over the world, okay, with sort of a hub in Israel. Palestine is the same. The Palestinians are sort of the same way, although that they're less. So that's an important understanding to think about, is that the Palestinians at this point are essentially a people without a state. So they don't have an actual like state for them to live in, to have legal protections under, to have rights from. Often what you'll hear in referring to Gaza is people call it the world's largest open-air prison because it's essentially an occupied territory that has been occupied since 1948 when Israel was created. So before I get more into more detail, I think it's important to provide listeners with some additional context. So where did this come from? Why is there Palestine? Why is there Israel? Why is all this going on? Well, with much of modern history, the development of the state of Israel can in many ways be tied to World War I. So, and I think we talked about this last time. Now the concept of Zionism itself goes back to the mid-19th century, if not earlier. But as a specific, explicit political project, it's about mid-19th century and particularly picks up steam with the 1880s and 90s. But World War I is the moment. So before World War I, the land that was known as Palestine, which is known today as Israel, and parts of it that are the occupied territories that make up what people think of as Palestine, were a part of what was called the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire collapsed during World War I, largely as a result of the British Empire guaranteeing certain countries independence in exchange for fighting on their side. Turkey is probably the most notable example of this.
Okay, yeah.
Where you have Kemal Ataturk and so forth. They were called the Young Turks, which is, most people think of Cenk Uygur now, but that's where that comes from. And so when Palestine became a sort of independent region of its own, and I say independent with really big scare quotes because it's not really independent, but separate from the Ottoman Empire, it becomes essentially a colony of the British Empire. And it's governed by the British from around 1920 till 1948. So the most, I think, striking chapter of the book, and the one that's probably the most controversial in this discussion, is the chapter called Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims. Mm-hmm. So the history of Zionism as a political project is tied to one of its founders, a guy named Theodor Herzl. There were other very influential Zionist political philosophers and leaders like Chaim Weizmann, Joseph Weitz, Theodor Herzl I mentioned earlier. So there was a slew of these guys. And I think it's important, and this is what I really want to stress, because this is something I wanted to stress the last time. One of the things that I think is a problem in our political discourse is there's often a sort of conflating of Zionism with Judaism.
Right, yeah.
And those are not the same thing. But the problem is that the way that mainstream discourse handles both of them is it kind of treats them as interchangeable. And that's not true. So the way that I think about it is this, And what I'm going to address tonight is this specific thing, which Said in the book addresses as well.
Okay.
Because it's very important that we critique this stuff from specific historical and material conditions. It's important because if we don't, then it does actually fall into the territory of anti-Semitism, which I think is important that we bring up in this conversation and say, like, look, like, it's important to avoid genuine anti-Semitism. So
yeah, anti-Semitism is bad.
Yes, it is bad. As people have called it before, I think Philosophy Tube, she did an incredible video about this a while back where she referred to it as being the socialism of fools, which I think she gets from somewhere else. But
yeah,
it's exactly
I've heard
right.
that before as well.
Anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, right? So what is Zionism? It's a really great question. And it's the one that he tries to address in the book. So Zionism was a political project that really started in the mid-19th century and really started to pick up steam by World War I. And what it was that the Jewish people who had been largely scattered around the globe and had felt the consequences of being scattered around the globe.
Right.
And again,
people without a state, right?
Yes, they were. And the way they referred to it as a people without a land without a people. That was the phrase that was used to that was the slogan of Zionism, right? Now, the people without a land part, that was absolutely right. The Jewish diaspora did not have a land. But the idea that there was a land without a people was not true. And people often wonder, why is the United States so connected to Israel? Why is that the case? And the argument that I think Said makes in the book, and one that I agree with, is that it doesn't have anything to do with sort of the cheap, disgusting kind of anti-Semitic tropes. Well, it's like, well, AIPAC rules the world, and you'll hear all this kind of bullshit.
Of course not. Yeah.
What it really is at its heart, Zionism is, according to Said, and I agree, is a European settler colonial project.
Yeah.
And it uses the sort of ideological architecture of European-style colonialism as its justification for sort of moving into the land of Palestine. So pre-1948, there were not as many Jewish people in Palestine, as we understand it as Palestine, as there were Arabs. And it's also important to note that there were also subcultures within the land of Palestine, which would later become Israel, that were not Arab, nor were they Jewish. So you had a Christian community, you had a unique sect to the region called the Druze, Druze, and then there was like one other one, I can't remember. Okay. So you have all these different cultures all in one small place. Keep in mind, Israel's not very large. And it's right next to Egypt. Jordan is right above it. And Syria is right next to it. So it's in this very small pocket. And Zionism's whole project was that thousands of years ago, the Jewish people laid claim to Israel, and that was their chosen land. Right. And what Zionism's project is to return to the homeland of the Jews, right? So it's important to note that Judaism is a religion and Zionism is a political project that uses religion. And I think those are the two things that I think it's important to understand how they're different.
Right.
I can stop there. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just thinking where does I've heard it said, obviously I'm still connected to the atheist community in various ways. And it's often discussed about Republicans in the United States being so pro-Israel because of their belief in theocracy in America. They really want to push forward like their Christian theocracy. Yes, I agree. And I think that's a huge part of it. And also a part of it that's super important is the way that they interpret scripture. So a YouTuber I really, really love, she's incredible, Rebecca Watson just did a video about this, where she talked about there's the ancient prophecy of Gog, or Magog, the city of Magog. And so there are a lot of right-wing evangelical Christian theocrats in the United States that support the Israeli
state in the Zionist project largely out of self-interest. So they'll talk a lot about like, oh, well, we care about the plight of the Jewish people. They don't really care about that. That's like that's the ideological architecture they put on top what they really want, which is that they believe by the return of a Jewish state and the establishment of a Jewish state that the Christ will come back and begin the sort of the rapture and the redeeming of the human race. Like that's what they genuinely believe. So that's a huge part of it, right? And I think that people who think of themselves as largely secular would nevertheless, who are part of the sort of right-wing project of Zionism, which I see Zionism as a right-wing project. I know that people think of it as being sort of there are liberal Zionists, people who like write for the Atlantic or Peter Beinart or whatever. But if you really want to understand like the nature of the situation, like liberal Zionism does exist, but that doesn't necessarily make it left wing.
No, I would argue that liberalism is also right wing, or at least centrist, right?
Yes. So there isn't like a left wing Zionism, right? That just doesn't really exist. So you're right in the sense that so the component you just talked about is super important, right? This sort of cultural, religious, ideological connection between sort of Zionism as a project and the United States and sort of right-wing theocracy as a project. But what I think ultimately ties them more together, and I think what Said argues in the book and I do, is that both of them are built on sort of European-style settler colonialism, which in my opinion, and Said writes this in the book, and I know this is controversial, but it essentially is based on white supremacy.
Yeah.
So the argument, and this really goes to the heart of a lot of the issue. So if you look at, let me see if I can find a quote here from one of the writers. I think it's really instructive because this stuff that I'm going to try to find here in the book, this passage from this journalist, it literally reads like something that Sam Harris could have written. It's incredible. So I'm going to read this to you now. So before I read this section, I'm going to preface this by saying that like there are a lot of people who are Zionists who believe in the project of Israel who are not racist. I want to stress that incredibly, okay? They're not racists, but the project itself, one of its unintended consequences is racism, because the way that it's set up is that Israel from the very beginning has always tried to set itself up as being connected to Europe. Mm-hmm. And it sees itself as an extension of Europe. It doesn't see itself really as a part of the Middle East, even though it is. It sees itself more in kinship with Europe. And there's a reason for that, which is that the justification for it is the same justification that the founders of the United States used to not only wipe out the Native American population in the United States, but also to subjugate African Americans in slavery, which is this idea of greater or lesser races. Scientific racism in and of itself is a huge component to settler colonialism in general and the Zionist project in particular. It's something you can't get away from. And with that in mind, I'm going to read you this passage. This is from a gentleman named Dr. A. Carlbach, who was a distinguished citizen of Israel and described by Zaid as not a crude demagogue. He wrote this article in the publication Mariv on October 7th, 1955. So we're almost 10 years out from the creation of Israel, which was in 1948.
Okay.
So this passage is fascinating. I may not read all of it because it's kind of long, but I'm going to read part of it. These Arab Islamic countries do not suffer from poverty or disease or illiteracy or exploitation. They only suffer from the worst of all plagues, Islam. Wherever Islamic psychology rules, there is the inevitable rule of despotism and criminal aggression. The danger lies in Islamic psychology, which cannot integrate itself into the world of efficiency and progress, that lives in a world of illusion perturbed by attacks of inferiority complexes and megalomania, lost in dreams of the holy sword. And it kind of goes on like that.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about the whole idea, and this goes, and to like sum this up perfectly, some of your listeners may know this, but there's this stupid, disgusting, racist tweet that Ben Shapiro did a few years ago,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Where he said, essentially along the lines of like, Israelis live in civilization and Arabs like to live in open sewage.
Yeah, yeah.
And this goes back into that whole paradigm, which is that settler colonialism is based on progress, right? So scientific advancement, scientific progress, which Israel has been a part of. There's no doubt that there's been some material scientific progress as a part of the Zionist project. There's no doubt. But it's also tied to this idea that the Arabs are ungovernable, that they are savage, that they are governed by their passions and not their intellect, that they are incensed by tribal notions, all of this kind of shit.
Right.
Which,
that's literally the rhetoric you hear about from racists all over the place, all over through time.
Right. And it's the same kind of argument, take out Arabs and put in, blacks or put in Asians. Like, it's the same shit. Right. Yeah. Which is that we are a part of a higher stage of civilization. And therefore, because we're a part of a higher stage of civilization, that gives us the moral license to do what we do.
Right, right.
And that is, I think, the problem of Zionism as a political project, is that from the get-go, it acknowledged that in order for it to succeed, someone had to fail, because it was never predicated on the idea that we would create a mutual agreement between Palestine and us, and that we would create a dual state or some kind of unified secular state where everyone lived together. That was never the project. Because ultimately, the Zionist project is an ethno-state project. It's the idea of a Jewish state for the Jews. And for decades, they basically denied the Palestinians that they even really existed. And so you would often have where they wouldn't even talk about them or they wouldn't even speak about them. So, from the standpoint of Zionism's victims, as Said calls it, is really the complete degradation of not just the political identity with which you affiliate with and the state identity that you were part of your whole life, but it's also a real destruction of your sense of dignity, of your sense of autonomy, and your sense of justice. Those all go out the window. And so, again, it's important to understand that, there's a logic to why Israel is the way it is, because it's built into the ideology that created it. And so it's basically seeing some people as less than human. And in doing that, it creates a project that ultimately justifies itself. And so when you hear dumbasses say things like, well, this is, and you've even heard politicians, even Obama, I think, has even said this, where they say, well, this is a conflict that's gone back thousands of years. Actually, that's not true. That's not even remotely true. That's total horseshit. First off, Islam has only been around for about 1,400 years.
Right.
So it can't be thousands of years, right? Judaism itself goes back, 4,000 to 6,000 years. Roughly. But the conflict itself is not thousands of years old. It can't be.
Yeah, no.
And you'll often hear this, I think even in atheist circles. This was an argument I believed in when I was more ignorant, was that if they could just get over their religion, then they could get along. But that's not the issue. The issue is one of national independence, where the British Empire essentially promised both sides of this conflict that we will provide you with national independence.
Right.
And then they renege on both of them. No surprise, right? So in World War I, it was called the Balfour Declaration, which we discussed before. And I think in the last episode, we talked about Lord Balfour's declaration, which was to create a state of Israel in then known as Palestine. And that was after World War I or during World War I. Obviously, that didn't happen. And then the Holocaust happened, right? And so there's a lot of understandable, the Jewish people should have their own home. There's a logic to that. There's a moral weight to that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make enough sense to build that, which is a moral project in and of itself, on land that is already occupied by people and not including them in that process.
Yeah.
So when Israel was created between 1944 and 1948, Israel was declared a state in 1948. you'll often hear politicians talk about how the United States of America was the first country to recognize the state of Israel. It did it 11 minutes after they declared it. So ultimately, if you look at, anyway, sorry, where I was going with this is, so with all of this in mind, what is the Palestinian identity, right? And so the Palestinian identity is one, and this is one of the other big chapters of the book, is what does it mean to be a Palestinian? Mm-hmm. And eventually, when we talked about earlier about the slogan of Zionism being, people without a land without a people. Palestinians are a people without a state.
Yeah. And
so they don't have the kind of political representation or political freedom that we would, or that even Israel has, right?
Right.
And so, today, and the thing is, there are many maps you can look at, pre-1948 Israel, the creation of Israel as a state, and then you have the pockets within Israel itself that were Palestinian territory. So you have the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and then you have East, I think it was Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Less so the Golan Heights today. Right. And part of that is because of settlements. So Israel over the last 70 years has continually pushed up against Palestinian territory and claimed it as its own. Right. And, after saying we will not do this, they proceed to do this, which is very similar to what the United States did with Native Americans, where we would make treaties with Native Americans where, you can stay in this land, and then eventually we would just either force them out or kill them. Yeah. And somebody posted a graphic that I think is instructive about how close the project of Israel is to the project of the United States. And it's like the land that the Native Americans get to have and the land the Palestinians have, and it just dwindles over time into just little pockets that they get to keep. And so they don't, you can't drive a car anywhere. You can't just leave anywhere. You can't, people in Gaza, I think, only have 4 hours of electricity a day. They live in absolutely inhumane conditions.
Yeah.
And so, and then for those who left, the identity of feeling like an outsider, that you kind of don't belong anywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And you would think that the people who founded Israel, who lived the very same thing as a part of the Jewish diaspora, would have some kind of sympathy for that. And I would imagine that many rank and file people do, but the leadership doesn't.
Yeah,
but the leadership just doesn't.
It often, it makes me think of you can probably talk to a random citizen of Israel and they would be, sympathetic, and they would say, yes, we need to do something to fix this situation. But as far as the people in power, the state itself, states don't like to give up power once they have it. Yes. So they won't give up resources, land, power, anything once they have them. So,
and again, you're right. And the thing is that I want to tread lightly here, because I think it's important that there are some scholars, particularly Norm Finkelstein, who's written a book called The Holocaust Industry, where he talks about the way in which, and again, his words, not mine. You can get shitty with him. Don't get shitty with me. I'm just a messenger. But that essentially, in some respects, that, some of the more cynical and I think, morally questionable, to say the least, people who support the Zionist project kind of use the Holocaust in a cynical way to sort of justify their own abuses against the Palestinians. And again, I'm not saying this is the majority of the people. I'm not saying that's what they do, but that's,
I was wondering, okay, when was the book written again?
So this book, The Question of Palestine, was written in 1979, and then he wrote a lengthy introduction and epilogue that were written in the early 90s. So again, so this book is written, I think, 10 years before the creation of Hamas. So Hamas doesn't come up in the book at all. Right? Yeah,
that's kind of what I was wondering. I know that Hamas's even existence and their role in Gaza is a tool that many people use to justify crimes by Israel.
Yes, and I want to make sure that we not excuse or the crimes of Hamas against people, but it is proportionality, right? So when Hamas fires off rockets, 1, 2, 3 people might die. Most of them are going to be IDF soldiers, right? When Israel shoots off in rockets in Gaza, they kill kids. I mean, they kill children, they kill women, they kill young people. They kill indiscriminately, and it's often hundreds, if not thousands, of people, right? Over 700,000 Palestinians were essentially evicted from Palestine between 1944 and 1948. And, so like we've seen time and time again, and a lot of times also that, Palestinian refugees ended up in Lebanon, and this, a lot of them ended up in Lebanon in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And when, Israel started to bomb, and started their war with Lebanon in the early 1980s, this led to refugee camps and refugee sites of Palestinians being bombed and killed. And there's indiscriminate violence that exists. And so again, it's because I think it's important not to say that like because it's, I don't know, like it's kind of the argument of like, well, if she hadn't worn that short skirt, she wouldn't have been, assaulted. I don't want to say
victim
that.
Blaming. Right.
Yeah, I don't want to do victim blaming here, but it's important to understand that like Palestine does not have an actual military. Like it just doesn't. Right. And so, Israel has a massive, well-trained, well-funded, largely by the United States, military that is extremely successful at its job, which is to obliterate people and to obliterate buildings. I mean, they do things by design, right? Like, so recently, one of the big news stories was them destroying the Gaza journalism building that had the Associated Press. It had Al Jazeera in it. And the justification that they used was, well, it was suspected that Hamas had leaders in there. And this was parroted by the Western press. And it turns out weeks later that no, that was a complete lie. Like they just made that up to justify it. Right. So Hamas is kind of like the catch-all explanation that sort of covers up the crimes of Israel. And it just shouldn't, and again, that's not to discount the actual crimes of Hamas. It just doesn't. But,
two things can be true at the same time.
Fucking A. Like, that's exactly right. So, and in many ways, Hamas was a logical result of the sort of the failures of the organization that Said spends a incredible amount of time on in the book and lauds quite a bit, which is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Okay. The
PLO, which was led at this time by Yasser Arafat, whom some people might know. He was very, very influential within Palestinian politics. He was a part of the Camp David Accords in 2000. He was a part of the Oslo Accords in the early 90s. And a lot of the sort of more radical end of Palestinian politics saw him as sort of a capitulator. And so, Hamas, in my opinion, was a logical result of some of the failures of the more moderate voices within the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah, like that sounds. I try to, on some level, like draw parallels, right? Like if we're drawing a parallel with North American settler colonialism, and we think like, okay, what would we say if indigenous peoples had started bombing things and started acting in like AIM, like, not that they bombed a lot of shit, but like,
exactly. Or the Black Panthers is another example.
Yeah, that's right. Like, from my perspective, these backlashes, they often seem very like justified, even if we don't necessarily like everything that they do.
Totally.
Right?
Yes. Because I think of it this way, it's like if you back a dog into a corner and you keep kicking it or you keep poking it with a stick, at some point it's just going to rip you. It's going to just rip out and revolt against you. That's the same situation, right? The Palestinian people don't have that much of a recourse against whatever Israel wants to do. Right. So, because again, they don't get to the tune of $3 to $5 billion a year for the United States, to kind of catch us up to today, because unfortunately we lost Edward Said almost 20 years ago now, and this book is a little bit more dated. I mean, the future for Palestinian struggle is the future of the struggle of the broader left. If you consider yourself a leftist, whatever stripe, you should find a kinship with the struggle for Palestine. Yeah. And there is some criticism within the left. I would call it the trad left, of people who say, hey, why do we almost always so weirdly focus on Israel? This is a criticism you'll often hear a lot about, like, why does the left always obsess over about Israel? Well, the main reason that I think it's important to talk about it is because the single largest foreign supporter of Israel is the United States. And I'm an American citizen, right? You know, my government is doing this stuff in my name. It's doing it in the name of our citizenry. So, and has been doing it for years. I mean, there's a statistic in here that between, you know, a period of 30 years from the 40s through the 70s or the 80s, you know, the United States gave $77 billion worth of aid to Israel, right?
Right.
So, you know, that's why I care. I mean, you know, and people, well, why do people always weirdly focus on it? And it's like, well, because it is the foremost struggle, right? And it is akin to South Africa, which is part of the reason why the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, is one of the most moral movements of our time. It's the thing that should, you know, this is exactly what was done with South Africa, and that's going to be the success going forward. And you're seeing a lot of bills across the country, especially in red states, trying to make BDS illegal, which is a violation of the First Amendment. It's a flat out violation of political rights. And these people talk all the time about how they care about free speech, but then it's like, well, no, it's for free speech you like. It's for freedom of you to say bigoted and racist shit, you know, on Joe Rogan's podcast. Like, that's the free speech you want.
Yeah, that's right.
So my thinking on the subject is that political leaders high within the government, I mean, particularly people within the Democratic Party, it's not enough. It's just not enough. I mean, the fact is that we have sitting members of Congress who say that Israel is an apartheid state is huge. Like, because it is. It objectively is. And I remember when I was in high school, when Jimmy Carter released his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, where he talked about this very thing. And there was a whole documentary about that whole era when that book came out. I think it was like 2007, you know, and Alan Dershowitz and all of the ADL and all of the usual suspects came out of the woodwork to call Jimmy Carter an anti-Semite because he had said this stuff. When he was saying very basic truths, you know, that were essentially like obvious to anyone involved. And because this book was written in the late 70s, this book took place after the first Camp David Accords in 78, 79, which were brokered between Egypt and Israel, which Jimmy Carter was a part of. It's one of his singular accomplishments as president. And so Jimmy Carter has a very lukewarm reception by Said in the book. He doesn't hate him, but he doesn't love him either. He's just, you know, I mean, I would say in the history of American empire, like, Jimmy Carter is certainly one of its softer faces. But
not perfect by any stretch.
Perfect, but he's still the face of the empire, right? But the fact that a former president would flat out say this is an apartheid state was like huge, and he got raked over the coals for that shit. But now that we actually have sitting members of Congress saying the same thing is great. What I would argue for those like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, AOC, I would love for Bernie Sanders to do this, is to flat out say we support BDS. That, you know, you should support BDS. And I know that, like, as a sitting member of Congress, that's a bold move to make. But I think that really separates the sort of the wheat from the chaff. To me, that's the moral movement going forward. It's not enough to just say these things are bad. You actually have to explicitly support the most broad-based, non-violent movement that's dedicated to peace and justice in Palestine. So, like, you either support it or you don't. And if you don't, then get the fuck out of the way because you're not serious. And had Said lived, he would have certainly have supported BDS.
Well, I just feel like I've seen some, I don't know, pretty harsh criticism coming from people that it seems like it's so disingenuous. Like, this idea that we're going to boycott things coming out of Israel. Like, how is that, you know, anti-Semitic terrorism or, you know, like I'm sorry, it's just not. Like, we're just not buying things from a state that is harming innocent people.
Exactly, right. And it's important you bring up the word terrorism, right? Because that plays a key part of the book where he talks about how huge segments of the population are often just referred to as terrorists. There's no discussion, there's no debate, there's no obvious evaluation of the facts of the case. They're just described as terrorists because that's the way of just to, you know, get it off the hook and you can do whatever you want. And we saw what happens when you do that kind of shit. And that was the Bush era, right? Where you had waterboarding and extraordinary rendition and political prisoners who, in Guantanamo Bay and all of the, the mass surveillance of Americans. We know what happens when you use that sort of logic and language of terrorism. So it's the same thing again, is instead of, because what calling all these people just terrorists or, they're just evil, they're all like Hamas. What that does for the Zionist project is it allows itself to get off the hook. It allows it to get sort of a get out of jail free card where it doesn't actually have to reckon with the consequences of its own project. It doesn't have to deal with them. It doesn't have to deal with the fact that you share this land with the people, that you forced a lot of them out, that you stripped away any rights of those who stayed, and you're continually taking the land and the literal lives of the people who stay. Yeah. All in the name of your project. And by calling them terrorism and just calling them terrorists, then you don't have to deal with it. Right. And so so it's important, I think, for people to understand that the way that the Western media, particularly the American media, covers Israel is almost terrible. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. Yeah. And so it's important to follow good sources, people who are good on this issue. So Norm Finkelstein is one. Abby Martin of the Empire Files, she's done an incredible documentary about Gaza that I highly recommend everybody watch. Katie Halper, anybody on the left who understands this issue broadly, they get it. And because ultimately what Said argues for in the book is a secular, either two-state solution, which is largely dead now. It's almost impossible. Or the mainstream position, which is a one-state solution where you grant full and equal political rights to Palestinians and that you return the settlement lands to them. That's the basic, that's the bare minimum. And so, Said makes the argument that what we need to develop is a sort of, much akin to the late Michael Brooks, this idea of a cosmopolitan, humanist, secular sort of polity that is rooted in human rights, that's rooted in true values that represent everyone and not just pockets of people or a particular ethnicity or particular religion. Yeah. And so that's really the future. That's the hope that we go for. So like I said, I think Question of Palestine, it's a great book. I highly recommend people check it out. Cool. Said was one of the best. And, until the very end, he was always a strong supporter of Palestine and its future. So, plus there's also a really great picture of him throwing rocks at IDF forces, which is just fun. While he was, dying of cancer, there's a picture of him in Palestine in 2000. He's throwing rocks and he's with these other guys, he practiced what he preached. He genuinely believed in the project.
All right. Where can people find your stuff?
They can find me at, justinclark.org, which is my website. You can find me, at Justin Clark PH on Instagram. I recently published an article on Lenin and religion with Midwestern Marx, the online publication, and I have an article coming out this month in the Truth Seeker magazine.
Oh, cool.
About Robert Ingersoll, my thesis subject, and his sort of supposed encounter with Lew Wallace, the guy who wrote Ben-Hur. I expect to be writing more for the Truth Seeker in the future. And read Edward Said. I highly recommend people go read the Question of Palestine. And then the other book I highly recommend people check out is a book called 10 Myths About Israel, which is by an Israeli historian named Ilan Pape. So.
Okay, cool. And I guess before we go, this is the first time we've been doing this on Twitch. This is the only place we're going to live stream this. Obviously, if you want to rewatch it, I will have this out in 2 weeks, approximately, when I'm done all the processing and everything.
And then I think what we'll do next time, we'll do The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, which we were going to do this week, but I wanted to do this book first to sort of. Yeah. But next week we'll be talking all about MMT, or next time.
Sounds good. Sounds good.